Okay, so can you all see the screen? Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a degree adverb 很 in Mandarin Chinese, which is often translated as very, but it's considered to have a quite bleak meaning in sentences like one, so that it gives rise to really a neutral positive reading like John is tall. So in particular, I'm going to question this with new data from like absolute gradable adjectives in Mandarin and explain why we get this kind of illusion that one is a neutral positive reading with an interaction between weak intensifiers and the vague nature of the relative gradable adjectives. So one nice outcome of my proposal is that we can actually maintain the language universal that no languages overtly realize for us. So I'm going to first give you a big background on Mandarin He. So it is quite well known that in Chinese, if you want to express John is tall out of the blue, it is quite odd to just use the bare gradable adjective form as in two, but you would need an unstressed adverb 很 to give the reading. However, it is also well reported that actually in many cases, probably in most of the other cases, 很 is optional and the positive readings can actually be expressed just with the bare form. So for instance, when we alter a polar question like is John tall, or answer this polar question with yes, he is tall, or he is not tall, or with a negation, John is not tall, or with some kind of focus, only John is tall, or in small clauses or the attributive use like help me find a tall actor. In all of the cases, as you can see, you have the bare form and we do get the positive readings. So it is, oh, sorry, oh my God. The reference. Okay, sorry. So it is actually still an ongoing debate about when 很 is required and why it is the case, but I can tell most approaches acknowledge that the positive semantics in Mandarin can be achieved in either the covert way with unstressed 很 or covertly as what we have in English. So basically they have the same semantic effect of turning the relational semantics of a gradable adjective like gao into a property of individuals whose relevant measure exceeds the contextually determined threshold, so that's in 9. So under those approaches, like 很 is required in some cases, is really for independent syntactic or pragmatic reasons. So I'm going to give you like a few representative approach to give you an idea, like how do we account for the distribution of 很. So for instance, one representative syntactic approach is from Grano. So he basically argues that the bare gradable adjectives can achieve the positive readings through a type shift, but in that case, it fails to project any functional structure to satisfy the selection requirement of the T head in Chinese. On the other hand, for 很, it really projects the DEC-P, which is extended projection of AP, which can satisfy this requirement. And his account can capture that 很 actually becomes optional for positive readings in many other cases, because that would be the cases where something else in the sentence, like a negation, can also satisfy the requirement, or when the T head is simply absent, like in the small cases, small clauses. So that's quite nice. So on another side, like one interesting pragmatic story from Li Mingzhang is to say that it's really about a pragmatic competition between the bare form and the form with 很. So the idea is that the bare gradable adjective in Mandarin in principle can express both comparative and positive readings, but for the bare form, like 17b is constantly blocked by a better way of expressing positive readings, namely the form with 很, because it's like unambiguous. So that's another way. So today I'm not going to the details of those accounts, because actually this is not the focus of this talk to directly contribute to this debate, but I promise I will get back to like how the new data from this talk can cast doubt on the pragmatic analysis in the literature if we have time. So instead, I'd like to revisit really this shared assumption of all of the those accounts that 很 is actually semantically equivalent to pause. So you might ask why we should really care about this, and in fact, there's a reason. So the reason is that 很, if it really overtly realized the pause, it kind of poses a potential counterexample to a language universal discussed by Grano and Davis. So what they found is that in the typology or across the languages, for gradable adjective, its positive form is always no more complex than its comparative form. So either the comparative form is like derived from its positive form or is identical with it. So for instance, in English, the comparative form is derived from its positive form. So either use the sound morphem ER or a word like more. And same in Spanish and French, we have this counterpart of more. And for languages like Japanese and Korean, actually, we have the case that the comparative form is identical to its positive form. And for Mandarin, if we just ignore the thing that hun is sometimes used for the positive reading. Kind of Mandarin also falls in this category because we also use the same, like the bare form gao for the comparative reading as in 23b. Now, the problem is that if hun really is semantically equivalent to pos, that seems to be like a case which like the positive form is really overtly marked by something, and that's really like kind of untested across the languages. And also that would be the case that the comparative form in this language is not always like normal. The positive form in this language is always no more complex than the comparative form. Okay, so that's a problem for this language universal. But the main claim of this talk is that I'm going to show that hun cannot be the overt counterpart of the pos, but actually it's really indeed a regular weak intensifier like English very. And the new evidence is that when we replace tall with some kind of absolute gradable adjectives like curved or empty in Chinese, we really get a strong feeling that it only has obligatory intensified meanings. And I'm going to provide an account to why it is the case. So the plan is that we'll first talk about how like the intensification effect of hun is sensitive to the relative versus absolute distinction in Mandarin. And I'm going to show that it's actually not a particular thing about Mandarin, but we can find independent support from the failed study about English vary, such that it is some kind of a general tendency of weak intensifiers across language. And finally, if we have time, we'll go back to some existing analysis, which similarly argue that hun is not semantically equivalent to pos. So now let's first talk about absolute gradable adjectives. So we all know that the semantics of gradable adjectives have three important kind of parameters. One is the dimension of the degree, the other is the ordering relation of the degrees, and thirdly, it's about the property of the scale structures. So for instance, for some of the gradable adjectives, it would use a totally open scale, such as tall and short. And for another set of gradable adjectives like curved, clean, or full, or empty, they're argued to use scale structures that are closed on one end or two ends. And we call the latter set the absolute gradable adjectives because they tend to use this closed endpoint as a threshold in the positive readings. And there's a reason which is provided by Kennedy about interpretive economy that gradable adjectives, like we tend to maximize the conventional meanings of lexile item, while for the relatively gradable adjectives, because there's no like such salient endpoints to provide the standard, we have to stick to context, and that's why we call it relatively gradable adjectives. Okay, now in Chinese, we can also find the counterparts of the absolute gradable adjectives like wan, curved, zang, dirty, or shi, wet, and also the maximum absolute gradable adjectives like zhi, straight, or man, full, or kong, empty. So at first time, it really syntactically behaves just like the relatively gradable adjectives in that they cannot like occur without hun in assertion like this road curved, like it's similar to odd, and they improve in exactly the same context. So for instance, in a polar question. Okay, so they look similar to have like a very similar distribution. Of course, a caveat is that we all know that the lexile items that are more or less translational equivalents in different language might have different properties. So the first thing I want to do is actually establish that those translational equivalents in Mandarin are actually absolute gradable adjectives with some diagnostics from the literature. Okay, so basically there were three diagnostics, and the first diagnostic is what I call the entailment patterns in comparatives. So the idea is that for comparative, in the form X is more A than Y, when A is a minimum standard gradable adjective, the comparative would require the comparee to have a non-minimal degree on the scale, which means it must exceed the standard. So in other words, the comparative would entail this road is curved. And similarly, when you have the maximum standard gradable adjective, the room is emptier than that room, that would require the standard, that room, to have a non-maximum degree on the scale, and that would entail that room is not empty. While for the relative adjectives, since it do not have any endpoints, and cannot use endpoints as a standard, you do not get this entailment pattern. So for John is taller than Bill, it's possible that John is not tall. It's also possible that Bill is tall. So that's the idea. So if we apply the test in Mandarin, actually we get exactly the same intuition. So if you say this road is more one than that road in Chinese, you do get that the comparee is positively curved. While for the tall cases, there's a difference that you can continue the sentences, say, okay, both of them are not tall, both of them are tall. So that's And the second test is what I call the negation test, namely for a pair of absolute antonyms, the negation of one form really entails the other. So for instance, for a scale of straightness or curvedness, really, as long as something has a degree, like on the scale, it would either be straight or curved, and there's no gray area like between the two. So this road is not straight, definitely entails this road is curved. But for relative adjectives, you don't get this pattern because we could have some gray area between tall and short. Okay, so similarly, like in Mandarin, it's this prediction bonds out. So when you say this road not curve, not one, you cannot follow up saying though it is not 直 either. But for tall, it's possible to do that. So you could say John is not Gao, though not like I either. Okay, and another third test is what I call the differentiation test. So the logic that for two things that are considered like usually like not tall in normal context. So for instance, the two cups here, A and B, probably they are not usually considered tall cups in normal context. But if we are given like a participant a task, like only with those two objects and ask them to, with a command saying that click on the tall cup, usually it's very easy for them to accommodate a threshold in this specific context so that A is considered as a tall while B is not. Okay, so the meaning is something similar like click on the taller cup. But if you replace the adjective with the absolute adjective, it's harder for people to do such accommodation. So for 47, both are curved. And if you say click on the straight road, it's really odd, and same for 48. Since both are empty, are not empty, it's very odd to say click on the empty cup. So basically, the threshold in the latter cases are not that like context dependent. Now applied to the Mandarin, yes, exactly, we get this contrast. So for the Gao case, you can say click on the tall cup, but on the other cases, it's very odd to say click on 直的那条路或者点击 empty 的那条那个 base. Okay, so in short, I kind of established that we really got this category of absolute gradable adjectives in Chinese. And since we just see that they have exactly the same distribution, like as relative gradable adjectives, we would expect that when we have hen in 53 and 54, it should give rise to the canonical neutral positive readings, namely the minimum standard reading and the maximum standard readings. So that's a prediction, but actually that's not what we get. Just like speaking about the intuitions, we feel that this road hen curved really means the obligatory intensified meaning that this road is very curved, while for 57 it would mean this road is very straight. So of course, we do not just like rely on the intuitions. I'm not going to provide several possible tests to show that actually minimum gradable adjectives with hen do not have the canonical minimum standard reading. So one scenario it would be something like here. So we have a bunch of roads and 3 of them are perfectly straight, and this road would be slightly curved. So probably this is not a best picture I could find. So I only mean that it only has a very mild degree of curvedness. And in this scenario, it's very odd to say this road hen curved. So the thing is that if it really got the canonical minimal standard reading, it should be possible because like it has a minimal standard, right? And that really forms a contrast with the bare form in Chinese. So in this case, since I need to find the cases where one is acceptable, so that's why I choose it. Sentence with only this road is curved. And in this case, we do get the contrast between the two sentences that 59 is much more like natural than 58. So of course, we can always accommodate that like the standard extremely high in this case, but the thing is that we could get a like clear contrast between the two sentences. Now, another test would be that if we negate the minimum gradable adjectives with hen, actually we find that it does not entail 0 degree on the relevant scale, which again would be unexpected if it gives rise to a canonical minimum standard reading. So for 60, we can actually say something like this road is not very curved, though I can see some curvedness. Okay, but if we just have the bare form there, 61, only this road is not curved, though I can see some curvedness, it really sounds like a contradiction in Mandarin. Okay, so what I want to show is that this pattern is actually fully expected if hen is a weak intensify like very, as you can see in the translation of those sentences. Now let's look at the cases with maximum gradable adjectives. Again, it would fail to give rise the canonical maximum standard reading, but instead what we see is that it would forces an accommodation of a non-maximum standard. So for instance, here we have 3 theaters. Only the first one is like strictly speaking empty, but all of them have a very high degree of emptiness because like only, so for the second one, I don't only have 2 people, and for the third one, you only have 1 person, okay? So in this case, unexpected, like we cannot say something like only this theater is很empty in this case. It sounds odd, but instead we could say that those 3 theaters are all很empty. So showing that with很, actually we're not talking about the maximum standard. In contrast, if we're just using the bare form, so 只有这家剧院空 or 这3家剧院都空, actually the judgment would flip. Okay, so in other words, with Han, we really get the anti-maximum standard effect, while for the bare forms, we get the canonical, like maximum standard reading. So here's just another example with full, but I would not repeat. So the thing here, again, I want to show that this pattern is exactly what we expect if Han is a weak intensifier like English very, because it has been pointed out in the literature that for very, it has this anti-maximum effect. So in particular, people say that for an empty restaurant, it is typically used to describe a restaurant with 0 diners, but a very empty restaurant would actually mean something like with a few diners. Okay, so that's the contrast we got. So what I show is that really in the case of absolute gradable adjectives, Han behaves like a regular weak intensifier like English very. Now the problem is like why people actually constantly get this intuition that Han is like sounds semantically glitched in the case of relative gradable adjectives. So one possibility would be that actually for 69, its literal meaning is actually John is very tall. It's just somehow because of the relation between the John is tall and John is very tall, like the truth conditional difference between the two are not very salient, such that it's so weak that people almost cannot notice this difference, while it's not the case for the case of absolute gradable adjectives. So actually that would be the main idea of my proposal. And I'm going to show some like both empirical and theoretical motivations for that. So as I said, my proposal is quite straightforward. I would argue that Mandarin Han is actually a weak intensifier across the board. So in other words, it has a very similar contribution of pause, except that it manipulates the threshold and would actually raise the threshold with some small context-dependent amount. Okay, so in other words, it has a regular intensified meaning. But when the threshold is vague, as in the case of tall, I would argue that raising this vague threshold with a very small amount actually do not result in a significantly different meaning, while when the threshold is not vague, as in the case of curved, you can actually get a clearly difference. Okay, so why this is the case? So first of all, I'm going to review some empirical evidence about English very from the face, etc. study. So actually they investigate the case of English very and how it interacted with the implicatures modified adjectives. So the sentence they're interested in is John was not very late. So for this sentence, it's very clear that the sentence has the implicature that John was late. And it's more or less like clear why this implicature can arise. Okay, so the idea would be something like the speaker could have used a better alternative. John was not late, which is structurally no more complex than the altered form and asymmetrically entails the altered form. So based on Katsia's definition of structural alternatives, it's a better alternative. And the reason the speaker does not use it is probably because the speaker does not believe the alternative is true. And if we consider the speaker is informed on this topic via this so-called epistemic step, we could get that the speaker knows that it's not the case that John was not late. So in other words, the implicature would be John was late. Okay, so it's very clear how we get this implicature. Now the problem is actually if we have John is not very tall. In English, if we do not put any stress on very, so John is not very tall, actually we cannot get this implicature John is tall. And what they are interested in why this is the case. So it's very interesting that first of all, based on the experimental data, they actually established this claim. So it's actually we cannot get this inference. And more importantly, they actually point out based on the experimental data that increasing a vague threshold with English vary is actually also less effective than increasing a non-vague threshold with vary. So in their experiment, they basically present the participants with a set of facts about someone's height or someone's arriving time and ask them to judge to what degree do they agree the assertion that someone is tall or is late, or someone is very tall, very late, or like the negative counterparts. So the results are shown here in their figure 2, which I captured here. So if we just focus on the orange curve, which represents the degree of agreement with John is tall, and the blue curve would be represents the degree of agreement with John is very tall. And if we compare the diagrams on the left and right, we see a very clear contrast. So in other words, for a vague gradable adjective like tall, almost like those two curves are really close to each other. So you cannot find a clear region in which people agree with John is tall, but disagree with John is not very, John is very tall, okay? And it's even striking that in the negative cases, those two curves are completely overlapping. Now for the late cases, it's very different in that for like you do find a clear region in which people really agree someone is late, but they do not agree that someone is very late. So the importance is that we see this contrast between the two. Okay, so in other words, they point out that the reason we cannot get the implicature is quite intuitive. It's just that it's very difficult for participants to identify individuals that are both clearly tall, but clearly not tall under any context. And that's why they consider that the assertion John is not very tall together with the implicature John is tall would lead to what they call a borderline contradiction. Okay, so while they do have some story about how this borderline contradiction can capture the implicature pattern, I actually want to make use of another formalization in the literature, which is from Thought 2021. So actually, I think she might provide some tools that are even more clear about how we capture this interaction between weak intensifiers and vague statements. Okay, so following Thought to model vagueness, she argues that the sentence should be really evaluated relative to both interpretations I and possible words W. And now we can define vagueness of a statement really as a different resolutions across interpretations. Okay, so here you can see for each sentence, you can actually resolve it differently, and it actually gives different sets of possible words that can represent its intention. Now, based on this, besides the regular entailment relations, we can actually further define what Thought calls the strictly stronger and definitely stronger relations between sentences, such that for two sentences, phi and psi, phi would be strictly stronger than psi if on each individual interpretation, psi asymmetrically entails phi intel psi. Okay, so that's visualized here. So on each interpretation, I1, I2, I3, this one is asymmetrically entails that one. While for the definitely stronger, it's a stronger relation such that for any two interpretations we pick out, phi on one interpretation would be asymmetrically entail in psi on the other interpretation. So that's a case visualized here. So basically for phi, even on its weakest interpretation, I1, it would be stronger than psi on its strongest interpretation. So that's the idea. So those tools are quite useful because we can actually model the interaction between vary and the vague statements like John is tall. So as I said, since so I'm going to argue that for Hun and vary, they basically have the same function. So they only raise the threshold for a little bit compared to their neutral positive reading. And since, as you can see, if you just raise the threshold for a little bit, it's well possible that across different interpretations of those statements, namely different ways of resolving the vague threshold data here, the intensified form would always asymmetrically entails on intensified form. So for instance, for John Hun tall or John is very tall on I1, it will not entail John is tall on the interpretation I3. So in other words, the only relation that holds between the two statements is a strictly stronger one, but not a definitely stronger one. Okay, so that's the relation. But on the other hand, if we're looking at a non-vague threshold, like this road is curved, So even though it still only increases the threshold a very little bit, so the intensified meaning is not clear, but remember that for joints curved, we are dealing with a kind of a non-fake statement in that the standard is the minimal degree on the scale. So in other words, we can model this property as that for all the individual interpretations, psi is actually has the same intentions. While for phi, even though it introduced vagueness, it's very clear that on whatever two interpretations you pick out, this road uncurved would be will asymmetrically entails this road is curved. So in other words, here we really get the definitely stronger relation between those two statements. Okay. So here is how would I explain the contrast. So I would argue that for Mandarin Zhuang Hantuo, while its literal meaning is indeed Zhuang is very tall, people basically cannot distinguish this reading very clearly from the neutral positive reading Zhuang is tall, because those two statements are not in definitely stronger relation, but just strictly stronger. So it's a different relation if we look at the sentence like Zhuang is curved versus Zhuang is curved. Oh, sorry, this road is very curved versus this road is curved. So in this case, we got a strictly stronger relation because one of the statements is non-fake. And for the empty case, I haven't talked about that, but actually you can imagine a similar, it's just the opposite relation. So for the theater is empty, it's a non-fake statement. And for the theater is very empty, it introduced vagueness, but it would be something like not definitely stronger than the other. Okay, so the important thing is that the asymmetry can really be attributed to the different relations between like those two statements between the namely the intensified form and the unintensified form. So one question you might ask is like, why in English, even though the effect of very is quite weak, why we can still kind of aware of the difference between Zhuang is tall and Zhuang is very tall? So in fact, I think another factor that it's very hard for native speaker to figure out the difference, like whether Zhuang很tall should be translated as Zhuang is very tall or Zhuang is tall, is because basically if we remove the intensifier there, we get an unacceptable statement because, as I said, there's some independent reasons that Zhuang tall is bad in Mandarin. And indeed, if we look at the cases where both the bare form and the form with hen are acceptable, as in 83 or 84, it's kind of that people get a more aware of this difference. So they would say like 83 or 84 are quite different, and the intuition would be very similar to how English speaker distinguish between Zhuang is tall and Zhuang is very tall. Okay, now I haven't talked about the implicature cases. So actually the first thing I like to point about that is that in Mandarin, the absolute gradable adjectives like curve or more precisely speaking, it's the minimum gradable adjective actually have the same pattern. So when you negate it with hen, so this road is not hen curved, you do get a strong implicature that this road is curved, but it's definitely not the case that when you say 约翰不是很高, like Zhuang is not very tall. So basically the same in English. So how do we capture that? Again, as I said, I would resort to thoughts form of like notion of definitely stronger. So she actually proposed in her like talk saying that like we can revise the anti-asymmetry like entailment relation in Cathill structure definition of structural alternatives, such that we can change like the definition for more informative as definitely stronger, as in 87A. So the consequence is that we can derive why for Zhuang is not very tall, we do not get the implicature. It's crucial because that for the intensified alternative, Zhuang is very tall, it's not definitely stronger than the unmodified form. And we would get the same, like not strictly stronger relation if we negate them. And in other words, Zhuang is not tall, is not like considered as a better alternative under such account, and that's why we do not get the implicature. While for the Zhuang was not very late case, because as I said, Zhuang was very late, is strictly stronger than Zhuang was late, we could get this implicature because Zhuang was not late is actually a better alternative than Zhuang was not very late. So that would be the logic. So in short, the main idea is really that hen is not an overt counterpart of a pulse, that is just a regular weak intensifier, and it's just an illusion that when we hear drawn hangao, people reported that it's drawn is very tall. Basically, it could either be drawn as very tall or drawn as tall. It's basically that people cannot clearly distinguish between those three readings, and we actually find independent support from the literature. And with this, we can really maintain the universal that Mandarin would just be a quite typical pattern A language as Japanese and Korea. So, and I'd like to briefly talk about the existing analysis since we have time. So as I said, most of the literature would say that Hun is mentally equivalent to POS, but we do have a few ones that also similarly argue that Hun is not mentally equivalent to POS. And I'd like to mention two of them. One is Fang's proposal. So Fang basically argues that Hun introduced subjectivity. So what's shared with my account is that she also agrees that for absolute graded adjectives, when they are modified Hun, they do not sound equivalent to the unmodified positive counterparts in English. And what she argues is that Hun really introduced a standard that is evaluated by the judge according to their epistemic knowledge. So my main problem with her proposal is actually the test that she proposed for subjectivity in her paper are actually problematic, so that they are not just solely targeting the subjectivity. So I'll give you one example. So for instance, she argued that for Hun wet or any adjective modify Hun, it can occur in the I find that construction in Chinese. And since I find that targets subjectivity, it shows that it's subjective, but actually it's problematic because for the find construction 感觉 in Mandarin, it's actually insensitive to the subject versus non-subjective statement, because they can embed statement like drawn as an Asian, which I consider is definitely non-subjectivity. So that's most of the other tests have this problem, so that basically I don't see how it different if we just argue Hun is like English very, which is a weak intensifier, which also brings in vagueness. So that's Fang's idea. And I'd also like to briefly talk about Krasikova's idea. So she also has a very similar proposal here, even though she does not refer to the absolute gradable adjectives. So she has a particular assumption about the gradable adjectives such that they have the comparative semantics, and Hun is really a weak intensifier that introduce vagueness to the standard. So the details doesn't matter. But I think what the analysis, our analysis agree is that both with Hun, we get a weak intensification effect. So my analysis on absolute gradable adjectives kind of support her analysis. But I'd like to also point out that actually she provides a pragmatic account for the distributional puzzle of Hun. So basically she argues that for 转拓, 约翰高 in Mandarin, it's odd because we have a stronger alternative, 转很高, which is modified Hun, and based on some, Gricean principles, you really you're required to use the stronger alternative, at least in upward entailing context. And she uses pragmatic story to capture why in those downward entailing cases, under negation, you don't need Hun. But actually, as it's very clear, the data on I just mentioned on absolute gradable adjectives actually would suggest that it cannot be the case, because we just said that for the gradable adjectives with the maximum standard like empty, adding Hun actually weakens the claim. So based on this contrast, and since we just said that for the maximum gradable adjectives like Kong, it similarly would require Hun in those cases. I find that this really shows that the pragmatic story does not work very well. So for now, it seems that the syntactic story of why Hun is sometimes required seems to work better. So I guess I'll stop here and conclude my talk. So so I just showed you some data on absolute gradable adjectives Mandarin and suggest that Hun cannot be an overt counterpart of a pose. And I also show that Hun is mentally bleached with relatively gradable adjectives. That impression is really elusive and can be exactly explained by the interaction between the effect of weak intensifiers and vague thresholds. And finally, the outcoming is that the language universal, that no languages overtly realized force can actually be maintained if we adopt this proposal. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. And yeah, let me know if you have any comments or questions.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice talk. Let's go ahead to questions. I will start off with a question. It seems to me you have another path to another potential way of backing up your argument that N is an intensifier. In English, at least, I don't know if it can be extended to Chinese. So in English, you cannot simultaneously specify a height and have a vary at the same time. So John can be 6 feet tall or very tall, but he cannot be very 6 feet tall. But if Hun were pos, there should be no problem with putting those two together. Is that a kind of argument that can be made in Chinese? Can you put the 6 feet together with tall in the first place? And then...
yeah. So we can do that. So 约翰高6尺, and it's a case that with Hun you cannot have the 6 feet. So quite similar to English. You cannot say from very 6 feet tall.
Yeah, so it seems to me that that is giving you support. That is giving another piece of strong support for the analysis that you're giving.
Yeah. That seems to be the case. Yeah, thanks for the point.
Okay, other questions? Chris Davis?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I'm kind of curious, sort of cross-linguistically within Chinese or Sinitic, like other varieties of even Northern Chinese, different varieties of Mandarin even, but maybe more generally like Southern Chinese languages or, Min or Cantonese. Also, like historically in the record for Chinese, written Chinese, how common is this phenomenon? Like this sort of dummy Han? I mean, like when you take a first-year Chinese Mandarin class, they always tell you, yeah, you have to put Han on there. We don't know why. It doesn't really mean anything. This is the kind of thing you learn early on. But I'm just kind of curious. Yeah. You get my point. I'm kind of curious, is there like a meaning shift that's happened? Can you do comparative stuff across time or across dialects or languages? Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good question. So first of all, for the dialects, like I think at least for Cantonese, for modern Cantonese, you also need a counterpart of a Han in those the same cases. But a very interesting point you just mentioned is about the historical records or the, I don't know, so diachronic study. So actually, it's indeed the case that in ancient Chinese, the positive reading just use the bare form. We don't need the dummy Han there. So dummy Han is really a recent thing. So that's actually kind of like what I'm working on, which is about the distribution of Han, which I did not cover today. But that really shows that so Han is like it's not needed if you are looking at the Asian languages, and it's only a recent thing. And the similar shift is that for the aspectual markers in Mandarin Chinese, it's also the case that in the Asian Chinese, when you express an episodic assertion, you usually do not need anything. So that's in the bare form, but now coming to the modern Chinese, you kind of need those aspectual markers. So you're right, it's actually there, if you like the diachronically study, there's a shift in terms of whether you need those dummy things. So something I don't understand is like why I don't see anything related is reported in other languages. So I know Tibetan probably has a similar thing, but I've never have a chance to actually look into this because I don't know this language. Yeah, but yeah, okay. But thanks for your question. That's exactly the thing I'm wondering.
Okay, cool. I look forward to seeing what you find out about that over the next while. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the
Okay.
question.
Aviv,
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Out of curiosity, are there cases where Han is optional? Say in the small clause in example 6, is it optional there?
Let me see. Yes. So I think at least reporting the literature. Wait, 6. Yeah, it's optional there in the small classes. I think 6.
Okay, so since it is optional, so you could construct an example like I consider John tall and Mary Han tall. And does that entail that the person considering considers Mary to be taller than John?
So 我觉得约翰高，然后玛丽很高。I think in this case, my intuition, so there are other native speakers here, so please correct me if you do not agree. So I just felt in this case, it's really similar to how you say this in English. So it's the same as you say, John, I consider John tall, but Mary very tall, something like that. So I feel that the degree of intensification there is similar to what we have in English.
Right. So in English, there is the implication that I consider Mary taller than John. So I'm curious if it's the same.
我觉得约翰高，约玛丽很高。Yeah, I would say yes. In this case, you do kind of get the feeling that Mary is a bit taller than John. But there are two things like I'm wondering about this example. The first relates to the intonation. So I don't know, like when you're repeating the predicate in the second sentence, and since you are altering those sentences together, it's possible that we are kind of putting some emphasis on the new information, which is there. And it's the same in English, like once you put stress on very, then the intensifying effect would be won't be a mild one, but it's a more extreme one. And that's the case that Lefebvre also points out, that when you say something like John is not very tall, like if you put the intonation on very, you do get the implicature that John is tall. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that I think why I say John is tall and John is very tall is they are not in definitely stronger relation, but as I said, they do hold in the definitely strictly stronger relation. So in other words, I can imagine like if it's altered by the same people, probably it's evaluated to like on each individual interpretation. You kind of would assume for the same people, he would use a more or less consistent standard in those cases. And in this way, the intensification of very should in fact be predicted to be there. So yeah, that's my second thing. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you.
In the English, if you have, you could have a case where John's a professional basketball player and Mary is a 4th grade student in elementary school. And John is tall and Mary very tall, but John is taller than Mary. There's nothing contradictory there. So in order to get the implication that you want, you somehow have to at least assume or force the comparison class to be the same.
Yeah, the comparison class would be different.
If John and Bill are both male NBA players, then you have a kind of a standard that's fixed for everybody. And you could say John is tall and Bill very tall. And I think that would then imply that Bill is taller than John. But you do need that either implicit or explicit to get the conclusion to follow. Is that the same? Would the same hold in the Chinese examples?
Let me see, because you probably also need the small clause to make the bare form to sound. So 我觉得看看 I don't know if it's the same in English, but I kind of need to explicitly spell out the comparison class with a for phrase. So I can consider John tall for basketball players and Mary very tall for kindergarten kids. So otherwise, it's a little bit odd to all this, except that the context is making very clear that we are considering who is tall in each group of people. So like the context need to be like set up in a specific way to make this work. But I think it's generally true that, as I said, if the bare form like without hen is already acceptable in Mandarin, and if you compare it with another form with hen, so in other words, in the cases where hen is optional, when you compare those two forms, people like they are able to distinguish between those two readings more clearly. So that said, one reason that people have this illusion is probably because there's a gap in terms of drawn tall, like which is for mysterious reason that I'm still working on. Yeah, so that would be my response.
Okay, other questions? Joe.
Is my mic working?
Yes.
I'm in
Yes.
the room. Okay, so
Yeah, I can see.
my question might not be directly related to your proposal, but so in English, there's two different types of very standardly used intensifiers, like very and so. Right, so that John is very tall and John is so tall, right? And I don't really know exactly how they're different, but the very seems to use a degree which is commonly understood, when so seems to be more subjective, which might be related to the one proposal about using a subjective, I forgot what it was, the thing. And I was kind of wondering if in Chinese or Mandarin, sorry, you had some kind of divide there, or maybe hen could do both, like like the nature of the degree that you're using for hen.
Yeah, so let me think about how do we say John is so tall in Chinese. So yeah.
So like if you said
yeah. So yeah, you can continue the sentence. Do you have something more to say? Because
I was just going to explain very and so a little better, because I was very vague about it.
yeah, if you could do that, that would be very nice.
So if you said that John is very tall, then just out of the blue, people would assume, well, in the US, people would assume that he's like 6'4", and in Japan, they might assume that he's, I don't know, 180 centimeters. But there's like this public notion. But on the other hand, if you said, oh, John is so tall, then you would have to know something about the person who said that to get an idea of how tall they think it is. It wouldn't be based on.
Oh, that would be a nice contrast to test. So so you're kind of saying for the so case, you really involve the evaluation of a judger, which needs to be the speaker, while for the very case, it's more like regular, like
a socially
increase.
determined.
Yeah, socially determined, context dependent. Yeah. That's interesting. So so I think there's actually, so for English, I can see the difference that so probably requires the subjectivity, while for very, I would guess that it could be either way. So it could be either public notion, or it could also be related to the judge's evaluation. So the reason I'm saying this is because I actually saw some papers arguing that for very, because it introduced some kind of vague amount of increase on the threshold, it kind of makes the whole predicate more subjective than it is, such that you can say something like, I find John is very tall, or very wet, but you cannot say I find John, this tower is wet. Like there's the difference that by adding very, you introduce subjectivity. But I usually, I used to treat it just as a side effect of introducing vagueness. So in terms of I first of all, I think there's a counterpart in Mandarin, which is 约翰如此的高. And I agree with your intuition that it seems more heavily dependent on who says that statement. And yeah, and that's very interesting, because I wish I could find some construction actually to tell, to actually show this difference besides my intuitive judgments. So as I just said, so English find would be a good, no, probably it's not a good construction either. So my problem is that I cannot find some construction that is, for instance, only selects the so tall kind of statement, but not the very tall kind of a statement. So if you know some kind of diagnostics, in English or other languages, I would love to hear about it.
Well, I mean, I
Yes.
haven't really done anything on this, but
yeah. But that seems to be, there's a contrast. Yeah.
There's one construction in English, which I'm sure everyone knows, which is, okay, he's so tall that he can't enter the door, or he can't go through the door. And so you're kind of specifying the degree with that statement. And so it's kind of like making it explicit. So, and you can't use very there. He's very tall, so he can't go through the door.
Yeah. That's indeed the case. So, John is so tall that, yeah. So I was also wondering, if you specify with that phrase, then does that actually require John to exceed the positive threshold? So when you say John is so tall, does that John is so tall that he can reach the shelf? Does that entail John is taller?
Tall in a general sense, in addition to
John is tall. Because I have the feeling that when you specify this degree,
I think there's an implication, but maybe the only semantically required degree is that maybe the shelf is low, and I don't think we'd say that the shelf is low.
Yeah, but you're right. I can actually find the exact counterpart in Mandarin that construction, and it sounds intuitively different from 很. So I would love to actually find some tests to show this difference. Yeah, thank you for your suggestion.